Ganyu is one of Genshin Impact's most well-known DPS units. She is a strong and flexible DPS that can deal with a variety of content extremely well. In this video, we'll explain her worth as a unit and whether or not she's worth your primogems before you wish. As always, if you enjoy a character for reasons like their voice actor, aesthetic, or personality, these videos are by no means meant to stop you from spending your primogems on them. Instead, they should prepare you for the type of problems that you'll need to solve or work around to meet your gameplay expectations. Ganyu is a flexible unit who can work either as a sub-DPS unit with 100% uptime on her strong burst and buffing herself and other cryo units, or as a main DPS unit by either being played in a freeze team with accompanying cryo, hydro, and anemo units, or in a reverse melt team with pyro units and a shielder. It is undeniable that Ganyu is one of Genshin Impact's strongest DPS units, but her strengths don't lie in her personal DPS numbers. In reality, Ganyu's single target damage is respectable, especially in melt teams, but does not break single target DPS boundaries, which has led many people to believe that Ganyu has fallen off. While it's true that other teams now surpass her in terms of damage potential, her true strength is her flexibility, as she can not only be played in freeze teams like the Morgana team, consisting of Ganyu, Diona, Venti, and Mona, but can also be played in Ganyu melt teams, comprised of Ganyu, Bennett, Zhangling, and Zhongli, with Kazuha as a potential replacement for Zhangling. She can even be used as a highly effective sub-DPS for other cryo characters, such as Ayaka, or for teams which require cryo application, such as Hu Tao Vape Melt teams and Razor teams. Ganyu is also very beneficial for new players. Even alone, Ganyu can output high overall damage compared to other units played by themselves, which is not only good for solo challenges, but also for those who don't have the units to create synergistic teams. For these players, having one unit who can dish out good damage without relying on other units to function decently is a massive blessing. She also has access to an extremely good free-to-play weapon, the prototype Crescent, and can also use Hamayumi in melt teams. Additionally, while her melt teams require highly contested supports like Bennett and Zhongli, her freeze teams can be played with units who have low overall usage rates, namely Diona and Mona. While Venti is generally the best unit for the 4th slot because of Ganyu's high synergy with him, other anemo units can be used to group units and shred resistance. None of these units are absolutely necessary for Ganyu to function. Her freeze teams can be played with other hydro units like Xingqiu and Kokomi instead of Mona, although playing with Xingqiu requires learning N1 cancels. She can also be played with other cryo units like Rosaria and Kaya instead of Diona for higher damage at the cost of lower survivability. It is also important to mention the strength of freeze as a reaction. Keeping enemies frozen can massively improve quality of life and DPS because frozen enemies cannot attack and stagger you, nor can they move and ungroup. Thus, if players can group enemies once, they can essentially keep them grouped forever if freeze uptime is properly maintained. This leads to huge damage increases, especially for Ganyu, because she scales harder than other units in AoE due to the nature of her burst. Essentially, what Ganyu offers is access to easy damage. She herself does not completely require battery since her energy recharge requirements aren't high, even in burst-reliant teams with short rotations, such as the Morgana team mentioned earlier. Moreover, she sometimes doesn't even need to or want to use her burst in melt teams. She can also snipe enemies from across the floor outside of melt teams. This means that players don't need to chase enemies down to deal damage to them, which is a massive advantage when players are fighting multiple ungrouped enemies in scenarios such as the Abyss. While it may seem like Ganyu is the perfect DPS, she does have some major flaws. First, while she's friendly to new players, optimizing her can be quite difficult. Her arguably best freeze teams are composed of 3 5-star units: herself, Mona, and Venti. Her best melt teams are not only 5-star reliant, as they can be composed of either 2 or 3 5-stars depending on whether players choose to use Xiangling or Kazuha, but are also reliant on Bennett, who's a very highly contested support. Second, her reliance on charged shots can be problematic for many players. A charged shot reliant playstyle does possess the advantage in that it allows Ganyu to snipe enemies from a distance, increasing her effective DPS because she doesn't have to chase after enemies. However, Ganyu can feel extremely difficult to play. This is because she can be difficult to pilot given the potential difficulty of aiming, especially on mobile devices, and also because her level 2 charged shot does take a while to charge up. Being interrupted during this charging time will lead to a massive DPS loss. She can't simply dash to dodge attacks like other units, because dashing cancels her charged attacks and causes her to miss out on some of them. This forces her to use some sort of crowd control or shielding to prevent interruption, meaning that she either needs to maintain high freeze uptime or run Zhongli, who is a highly appreciated unit in her melt teams. This problem is less apparent for freeze teams, which have built-in crowd control and are less reliant on Ganyu's charge shots, but the problem makes itself very apparent in melt teams, which can be difficult to play given its battery requirements, as players need to keep Bennett and Xiangling or Kazuha's bursts up off cooldown repeatedly. This can require upwards of 220 or even 250% energy recharge on Bennett and Xiangling or Kazuha, and or needing highly refined Favonius weapons. Third, Ganyu can compete in many cases with Ayaka. While it's possible to simply use Ganyu and Ayaka together, Ganyu is not irreplaceable in this position, and units like Kaya, Rosaria, and Shenhe can function nearly as well, if not better than Ganyu, as Ayaka supports. Ayaka does hold some advantages over Ganyu, including higher overall DPS and ease of battery, but also does not have some of the advantages that Ganyu has, like range. Simply put, while Ganyu and Ayaka are different in some aspects, Ayaka generally already occupies the cryo DPS niche for most players. This makes Ganyu less worth rolling if players already have Ayaka. Lastly, Ganyu's damage is not relatively high when compared to other cohesive teams. She's no slacker when it comes to damage, and the Morgana team is nearly incomparable in terms of AoE damage, provided that enemies can be grouped and frozen. But her single target damage isn't super impressive outside of Melt for a multitude of factors, especially the fact that her inability to snapshot buffs onto her charged attacks. This has led to lower usage rates in recent Abyss cycles, where the focus has shifted from defeating smaller enemies to defeating targets with huge amounts of health and unfreezable bosses. Ganyu's strength is that she has a high damage floor due to her massive solo output, but her team damage ceiling is lower than other well-constructed synergistic teams. As for Ganyu's Constellations, C1 is quite strong for its shred and extra energy, while C2 is generally only useful if players also unlock C6. C3 can vary in usefulness, from being extremely good for burst-reliant teams like Morgana, to useless in teams where Ganyu doesn't use her burst, like in Kazuha Melt. C4 increases her support capabilities by a decent margin, as percent damage buffs are highly appreciated by nearly all units, and Ganyu can have high uptime on her C4 buff. C5 is mostly useless, given that her skill generally does not constitute a large portion of damage. Lastly, C6 can be extremely useful for nuking down enemies very quickly, and allows Ganyu to get in more charged shots per rotation, increasing her DPS significantly. So, when should you roll for Ganyu? Players should consider rolling for Ganyu if they want access to a cryo unit who can almost always remain relevant on their account and has a multitude of teams. Players should also consider rolling for Ganyu if they're new to the game, as her high solo output and access to free-to-play weapons can carry them for quite a while without needing significant investment in other units. Lastly, players should consider Ganyu if they need a unit who can very easily deal with many groupable and freezable units. When should you not roll for Ganyu? Players should consider skipping Ganyu if they need a DPS unit who can deal extremely high single target damage with a well-invested team, as Ganyu's contribution is usually outmatched by other well-built synergistic teams. They should also consider skipping Ganyu if they have trouble with aiming, as Melt Ganyu is highly reliant on charged shots and inability to hit these shots will lead to a significant damage loss. Lastly, players who already have Ayaka as a freeze DPS may not gain much value from pulling Ganyu. Here's a quick rundown on Ganyu's pros and cons. Pros. She has a high solo damage output. She can be used in a wide variety of teams, both as a main DPS and as a sub DPS. She has a high AoE output in the Morgana team, and she's got access to strong free-to-play weapons such as the Prototype Crescent and sometimes Hamayumi. She can snipe enemies from across Abyss floors, reducing the damage loss caused by chasing enemies, and she's got high nuking potential in Melt playstyles. Lastly, she can make use of Blizzard's Strayer, which is an extremely strong artifact set. Some cons include that she requires high-demand units in Melt and several 5-star supports in her strongest freeze teams. She doesn't have extremely high single-target damage output, and her best free-to-play weapon is reliant on headshots. Many new enemies don't actually have a head hitbox. She can be mechanically hard to play, especially in charged shot reliant playstyles like Melt. She can compete with Ayaka, which diminishes her value if players already have Ayaka. She requires shielding or crowd control in order to avoid interruption during her charged shots. Thanks for watching this quick overview of the Kuting main theory crafting staff's thoughts on Ganyu. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and we will do our best to answer.